On Tuesday, March 21st, this being 1775 still, I arrived in London, and on repairing to Dr. Johnson's before dinner, found him in his study, sitting with Mr. Peter Garrick, the elder brother of David, strongly resembling him in countenance and voice, but of more sedate and placid manners. Johnson informed me that, quote, though Mr. Beauclerk was in great pain, it was hoped he was not in danger, and that he now wished to consult Dr. Herbeden to try the effect of a new understanding. New understanding is in italics. Unquote. Both at this interview and in the evening at Mr. Thrale's, where he and Mr. Peter Garrick and I met again, he was vehement on the subject of the Ossian controversy, observing, quote, we do not know that there are any ancient Erse manuscripts. We have no other reason to disbelieve that there are men with 3 heads, but that we do not know that there are any such men. This is true. Unquote. He also was outrageous upon his supposition that my countrymen, quote, love Scotland better than truth, unquote, saying, quote again, all of them, nay, not all, but droves of them, would come up and attest anything for the honor of Scotland, unquote. He also persevered in his wild allegation that he questioned if there was a tree between Edinburgh and the English border older than himself. I assured him he was mistaken and suggested that the proper punishment would be that he should receive a stripe at every tree above 100 years old that was found within that space. He laughed and said, I believe I might submit to it for a bawbee, B-A-U-B-E. The doubts which, in my correspondence with him, I had ventured to state as to the justice and wisdom of the conduct of Great Britain towards the American colonies, while I at the same time requested that he would enable me to inform myself upon that momentous subject, he had altogether disregarded, and had recently published a pamphlet entitled Taxation, No Tyranny, an answer to the resolutions and address of the American Congress. He had long before indulged most unfavorable sentiments of our fellow subjects in America. For as early as 1769, I was told by Dr. John Campbell, that Johnson had said of them, Sir, they are a race of convicts, and ought to be thankful for anything we allow them short of hanging. Wow. On this performance, I avoided to talk with him, for I had now formed a clear and settled opinion that the people of America were well warranted to resist a claim that their fellow subjects in the mother country should have the entire command of their fortunes by taxing them without their own consent, and the extreme violence which it breathed appeared to me so unsuitable to the mildness of a Christian philosopher and so directly opposite to the principles of peace which Johnson had so beautifully recommended in his pamphlet respecting Falkland Islands, that I was sorry to see him appear in so unfavorable a light. Besides, I could not perceive in it that ability of argument, or that felicity of expression for which he was, upon other occasions, so eminent. Positive assertion, sarcastical severity, and extravagant ridicule, which he himself reprobated as a test of truth, were united in this rhapsody. That this pamphlet was written at the desire of those who were then in power, I have no doubt, and indeed he owned to me that it had been revised and curtailed by some of them. He told me that they had struck out one passage which was to this effect, quote, that the colonists, with no solidity, argue from their not having been taxed while in their infancy, that they should not now be taxed. We do not put a calf into the plough, we wait till he is an ox. Unquote. Johnson said, they struck it out either critically as too ludicrous or politically as too exasperating. I care not which. It was their business. If an architect says, I will build 5 stories, and the man who employs him says, I will have only 3, the employer is to decide. Yes, sir, said I. in ordinary cases, but should it be so when the architect gives his skill and labor gratis? Unfavorably, as I am constrained to say my opinion of this pamphlet was, yet since it was congenial with the sentiments of numbers at the time, and as everything relating to the writings of Dr. Johnson is of importance in literary history, I shall therefore insert some passages which were struck out. It does not appear why, either by himself or those who revised it. They appear printed in a few proof leaves of it in my possession, marked with corrections in his own handwriting. I shall distinguish them by italics. Are you ready? In the paragraph where he says the Americans were incited to resistance by European intelligence from, quote, men whom they thought their friends, but who were friends only to themselves, unquote, there followed, and this part is in italics, and made by their selfishness the enemies of their country. And the next paragraph ran thus, quote, on the original contrivers of mischief, italics, rather than on them whom they have deluded, on italics, let an insulted nation pour out in its vengeance, unquote. The paragraph which came next was in these words, and this is in italics. Unhappy is that country in which men can hope for advancement by favoring its enemies. The tranquility of stable government is not always easily preserved against the machinations of single innovators. But what can be the hope of quiet when factions hostile to the legislator can be openly formed and openly avowed? On italics. Is that a phrase on italics? Is unquote? I feel like unquote is, but I don't know if on italics is. After the paragraph, which now concludes the pamphlet, there followed this, in which he certainly means the great Earl of Chatham, and glances at a certain popular Lord Chancellor. In footnotes here from a later editor, it says this Lord Chancellor was Lord Camden. And this part is all in italics. If, by the fortune of war, they drive us utterly away, what they will do next can only be conjectured. If a new monarchy is erected, they will want a king. He who first takes into his hands the scepter of America should have a name of good omen. William has been known both as conqueror and deliverer, and perhaps England, however contemned, might yet supply them with another William. Whigs, indeed, are not willing to be governed, and it is possible that King William may be strongly inclined to guide their measures, not mismeasures, measures. But Whigs have been cheated like other mortals, and suffered their leader to become their tyrant under the name of their protector. What more they will receive from England, no man can tell. In their rudiments of empire, they may want a chancellor. Then came this paragraph in italics. Their numbers are, at present, not quite sufficient for the greatness which, in some form of government or other, it is to rival the ancient monarchies. But by Dr. Franklin's rule of progression, they will, in a century and a quarter, be more than equal to the inhabitants of Europe. When the Whigs of America are thus multiplied, let the princes of the earth tremble in their palaces. If they should continue to double and to double, their own hemisphere would not contain them. But let not our boldest oppugners, that's a word I don't know, O-P-P-U-G-N-E-R, oppugners of authority, look forward with delight to their futurity of Whiggisms. This reminds me, it'd be a good battle royale would be Benjamin Franklin versus Sam Johnson. How it ended, I know not, as it is cut off abruptly at the foot of the last of these proof pages. His pamphlets in support of the measures of administration were published on his own account, and he afterwards collected them into a volume with the title of Political Tracts by the Author of the Rambler, with this motto: Fallitur egregio quicis sub principe credit, servitium numquam libertas gratior extat quam sub regio pio, which is from Claudianus. And that means, of course, he errs who deems obedience to a phrase, he errs who deems obedience to a prince slavery. A happier freedom never reigns than with a pious monarch. All right. These pamphlets drew upon his numerous attacks. Against the common weapons of literary warfare he was hardened. But there were two instances of animadversion, a word I cannot pronounce, which I communicated to him, and from what I could judge, both from his silence and his looks, appeared to me to impress him much. One was a letter to Dr. Samuel Johnson, occasioned by his late political publications. It appeared previous to his Taxation No Tyranny, and was written by Dr. Joseph Towers. In that performance, Dr. Johnson was treated with respect due to so eminent a man, while his conduct as a political writer was boldly and pointedly arraigned, as inconsistent with the character of one who, if he did employ his pen upon politics, quote, it might reasonably be expected should distinguish himself not by party violence and rancor, but by moderation and by wisdom. Unquote. He concluded thus, quote, I would, however, wish you to remember, should you again address the public under the character of a political writer, that luxuriance of imagination or energy of language will ill compensate for the want of candor, of justice, and of truth. And I shall only add that should I hereafter be disposed to read, as I heretofore have done, the most excellent of all your performances, The Rambler, the pleasure which I have been accustomed to find in it will be much diminished by the reflection that the writer of so moral, so elegant, and so valuable a work was capable of prostituting his talents in such productions as The False Alarm, The Thoughts on the Transactions Respecting Falkland Islands, and The Patriot. Unquote. I am willing to do justice to the merit of Dr. Towers, of whom I will say that although I abhor his Whiggish democratical notions and propensities, for I will not call them principles, I esteem him as an ingenious, knowing, and very convivial man. The other instance was a paragraph of a letter to me from my old and most intimate friend, the Reverend Mr. Temple, who wrote the character of Gray, which has had the honor to be adopted both by Mr. Mason and Dr. Johnson in their accounts of that poet. The words were, quote, how can your great, I will not say your pious, but your moral friend, support the barbarous measures of an administration which they have not the face to ask even their infidel pensioner Hume to defend? Unquote. So diss on Hume there. However confident of the rectitude of his own mind, Johnson may have felt sincere uneasiness that his conduct should be erroneously imputed to unworthy motives by good men, and that the influence of his valuable writing should on that account be in any degree obstructed or lessened. He complained to a right honorable friend, footnote tells us this is actually William Gerard Hamilton, of distinguished talents and of very elegant manners, with whom he maintained a long intimacy, and whose generosity towards him will afterwards appear, that his pension having been given to him as a literary character, he had been applied to by administrations to write political pamphlets, and he was even so much irritated that he declared his resolution to resign his pension. His friend showed him the impropriety of such a measure, and he afterwards expressed his gratitude, and said he had received good advice. To that friend he once signified a wish to have his pension secured to him for his life, but he neither asked nor received from government any reward whatsoever for his political labors. On Friday, March 24th, I met Johnson at the Literary Club, where Mr. Beauclerk, I'm going to pronounce it that way again, Mr. Langton, Mr. Coleman, Dr. Percy, Mr. Vesey, Sir Charles Banbury, Dr. George Fordyce, Mr. Stevens, and Mr. Charles Fox. Were there, I guess. Before he came in, we talked of his journey to the Western Islands and of his coming away willing to believe the second sight. It says here, C. Johnson's journey to the Western Islands of Scotland, which seemed to excite some ridicule. I was then so impressed with the truth of many of the stories of it, which I had been told, that I avowed my conviction, saying, quote, "He's only willing to believe. I do believe. The evidence is enough for me, though not for his great mind. What will not fill a quart bottle will fill a pint bottle. I am filled with belief. Are you?" said Coleman. "Then cork it up." I found his journey the common topic of conversation in London at this time, wherever I happened to be. At one of Lord Mansfield's former Sunday evening conversations, strangely called levees, his lordship addressed me, quote, "We have all been reading your travels, Mr. Boswell." I answered I was but the humble attendant of Dr. Johnson. The Chief Justice replied, with that air and manner which none, who ever saw and heard him, can forget, quote, "He speaks ill of nobody but Ossian." Johnson was in high spirits this evening at the club, and talked with great animation and success. He attacked Swift, as he used to do upon all occasions. The Tale of a Tub is so much superior to his other writings that one can hardly believe he was the author of it. Quote, "There is in it such a vigor of mind, such a swarm of thoughts, so much of nature and art and life." Unquote. I wondered to hear him say Gulliver's Travels, quote, "When once you have thought of big men and little men, it is very easy to do all the rest." Unquote. I endeavored to make a stand for Swift and tried to arouse those who were much more able to defend him, but in vain. Johnson at last, on his own accord, allowed very good merit to the inventory of articles found in the pocket of the Man Mountain, particularly the description of his watch, which it was conjectured was his god, as he consulted it upon all occasions. He observed that, quote, "Swift put his name to but two things, after he had a name to put: the plan for the improvement of the English language, and the last Drapier's letter." Now, there's a footnote here about the authenticity of the Tale of the Tub. This doubt has been much agitated on both sides, I think without good reason. See Addison's Freeholder, May 4th, 1714. An apology for the Tale of a Tub. Also, Dr. Hawkesworth's preface to Swift's works, and Swift's letter to Tooke the printer, and Tooke's answer in that collection. Sheridan's Life of Swift, Mr. Courtenay's note on page 3 of his poetical review of the literary and moral character of Dr. Johnson, and Mr. Cooksey's essay on the life of a character of John Lord Somers, Baron of Evesham. Dr. Johnson here speaks only of the internal evidence. I take leave to defer from him having a very high estimation of the powers of Dr. Swift. His Sentiments of a Church of Englishmen, his Sermon on the Trinity, and other serious pieces prove his learning as well as his acuteness in logic and metaphysics. And his various compositions of a different cast exhibit not only wit, humor, and ridicule, but a knowledge of nature and art and life. A combination, therefore, of those powers when, as the Apology says, the author was young, his invention at the height, and his reading fresh in his head, might surely produce the Tale of the Tub. I'm going to read one more paragraph. From Swift, there was an easy transition to Mr. Thomas Sheridan. Johnson said, "Sheridan is a wonderful admirer of the tragedy of Douglas and presented its author with a gold medal. Some years ago, at a coffee house in Oxford, I called to him, 'Mr. Sheridan, how come you to give a gold medal to Home for writing that foolish play?' This, you see, was wanton and insolent, but I meant it to be wanton and insolent. A medal has no value but as a stamp of merit, and it was Sheridan to assume to himself the right of giving that stamp. If Sheridan was magnificent enough to bestow a gold medal as an honorary reward of dramatic excellence, he should have requested one of the universities to choose the person on whom it should be conferred. Sheridan had no right to give a stamp of merit. He was counterfeiting Apollo's coin. And there we have it. Right from the horse's mouth. Bye from Boswell.